Hello, dear friend, and welcome to this quiet corner of history. Tonight, we set aside the noise of the present and wander gently into the stories of the past. Whether you're curled up beneath the blankets, resting after a long day, or simply seeking calm company for your evening, I'm grateful you've chosen to be here. If you'd like, share in the comments where in the world you're listening from. I always love seeing how far this community stretches across time zones and continents. And if these soothing journeys through history bring you comfort, consider subscribing so we can meet again. For now, let's loosen the weight of the modern world and step softly into the echoes of yesterday. Tonight, we journey to the heart of London, to a square that has witnessed revolutions and celebrations, protests and coronations, the quiet passing of ordinary days and the thunderous arrival of history itself. But we're not simply walking across the stones of Trafalgar Square as it exists today, bustling with tourists and pigeons, flanked by the National Gallery and watched over by Nelson's Column. No, we're going deeper. We're descending through the layers of time, peeling back the centuries like the pages of an ancient book, to discover what lies beneath: the hidden rivers, the forgotten villages, the medieval streets, the Roman settlements, and even the prehistoric wilderness that existed long before London had a name. Trafalgar Square sits at the symbolic center of London, the point from which all distances in Britain are measured. It's a place of monuments and memory, where the nation gathers to mark its triumphs and tragedies. But like so much of London, its surface tells only a fraction of the story. Beneath the flagstones and fountains, beneath the underground stations and Victorian sewers, lies a palimpsest of human habitation stretching back thousands of years, each layer leaving its mark, each generation building upon the ruins of the last. To understand what lies beneath Trafalgar Square, we must first understand the geography that shaped this place long before humans arrived. London exists because of its river, the Thames, that ancient waterway that winds through the heart of the city like a living thing, connecting the interior of Britain to the wider world. The Thames has always been London's reason for being, its highway and its boundary, its source of life and sometimes its destroyer. But the Thames is not the only river that flows through London. Once, the landscape was crisscrossed with streams and tributaries, small rivers that carved their way through the hills and valleys, creating a network of waterways that determined where people could live, where they could cross, where they could build. Most of these rivers are gone now. Not truly gone, but hidden, buried beneath centuries of urban development, forced into pipes and culverts, flowing invisibly beneath the streets in a shadow network of lost rivers. One of these lost rivers is the Tyburn, and its story is intimately connected to Trafalgar Square. The Tyburn rose in the hills of Hampstead, bubbling up from springs in what is now a peaceful suburb but was once wild heath and woodland. It flowed southward, gathering smaller streams as it went, winding through the landscape in the way that water always does, following the path of least resistance, carving its channel deeper with each passing year. The Tyburn followed roughly the route of what is now Marylebone Lane, flowing past what would one day become Oxford Street, down through Mayfair, and then curving eastward. And here, in the vicinity of what is now Trafalgar Square, the Tyburn's path brought it close to the Thames. This was low-lying ground, marshy and prone to flooding, the kind of place where water collected in pools and the earth was soft beneath your feet. It was not, initially, the kind of place where anyone would choose to build a city. But let's go back even further, to a time before the Tyburn had a name, before there were people here to name it. Imagine this landscape 10,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age. The great glaciers that had covered much of Britain were retreating northward, leaving behind a transformed land. The Thames was wider then, a braided river system that spread across a broad floodplain, its channels shifting with the seasons, its banks undefined and marshy. The area where Trafalgar Square would one day stand was part of this floodplain, a wilderness of reed beds and willow thickets, of water meadows and gravel islands. It would have been a landscape of extraordinary richness, teeming with life. Herds of aurochs, the great wild cattle that were the ancestors of modern domestic cattle, would have grazed on the lush vegetation. Wild horses roamed the higher ground. Red deer and roe deer picked their way through the woodlands that covered the surrounding hills. Beavers built their lodges along the smaller streams, their dams creating ponds and wetlands that supported an abundance of waterfowl. And there were people, though few in number. The Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who lived in Britain after the Ice Age were nomadic, moving with the seasons, following the game herds, harvesting the plants and fish and birds that the landscape provided. They would have known this place, would have camped here on the gravel terraces above the floodplain, close enough to the river to take advantage of its resources but high enough to avoid the seasonal floods. These were people who lived lightly on the land, leaving behind only the faintest traces of their existence, a few stone tools, the charcoal from their campfires, the remains of the meals they ate. But they knew this landscape intimately, knew where the fish gathered in the shallows, where the hazel trees grew thickest in autumn, where the flint nodules could be found for making tools. They would have given names to the places they knew, though those names are lost to us now, erased by the millennia that followed. The climate was still warming, still becoming the temperate, rainy environment that would characterize Britain for the rest of human history. Forests were spreading across the land, oak and elm, lime and ash, creating the dense wildwood that would cover most of the island. As the forests thickened, the landscape changed. The herds of large game that had thrived on the open grasslands found less room to roam. The hunter-gatherers adapted, becoming more specialized, developing better tools for fishing and fowling, learning to hunt the forest game, boar and deer, that replaced the Ice Age megafauna. And then, around 6,000 years ago, something fundamental changed. New people arrived in Britain, or perhaps the old inhabitants learned new ways. The archaeological record is unclear on this point. What is certain is that farming came to the British Isles. People who had once moved constantly now began to stay in one place. They cleared the forests, planted crops, kept domestic animals. They built more permanent dwellings, established settlements, marked out territories. This was the Neolithic, the New Stone Age, and it transformed the landscape around what would become London. The forests were cut back, creating fields for growing wheat and barley. The marshes along the Thames were avoided, they remained wild, difficult places, home to waterfowl and fish but not to farmers. But the higher ground was cleared and cultivated. The Tyburn and the other small rivers that fed into the Thames became boundaries, marking the edges of tribal territories, the limits of settled land. On the gravel terraces north of the Thames, Neolithic farmers built their scattered homesteads. Clusters of timber houses surrounded by fields rested from the forest. They buried their dead in long barrows, earthen mounds that dotted the landscape, markers of territory and memory. Some of these barrows may have existed in the area around modern Trafalgar Square, though if they did, they have long since been obliterated by subsequent building. The Neolithic people also gathered for ceremonies at special places, stone circles, henges, riverside sites where the boundary between earth and water seemed thin, charged with sacred significance. We don't know if there was such a site in the immediate vicinity of what would become Trafalgar Square, but we can imagine the landscape of that time. The cleared fields giving way to dense forest, the rivers winding through the valleys, the smoke from cooking fires rising into the evening sky, the sound of cattle lowing, children playing, the rhythmic thunk of stone axes against wood. Then came bronze, that revolutionary alloy of copper and tin that gave its name to an age. The Bronze Age brought more change, more clearing of the forest, more intensive farming, the beginning of trade networks that connected Britain to the wider world of Europe. Bronze axes and spears, bronze jewelry and tools, began to appear in Britain, objects of beauty and power that had to be imported from distant lands where the necessary metals could be found. The Thames became more important during the Bronze Age as a trade route. Boats carried goods up and down the river, connecting the interior of the island with the coast, and beyond the coast with the continent. The marshes and low-lying areas along the Thames were still avoided for settlement, but they were crossed, and where they were crossed, trackways were built, paths of timber laid across the wet ground, allowing people and animals to pass without sinking into the mud. Some of these Bronze Age trackways probably crossed the area where Trafalgar Square now stands, though they lie deep beneath the modern city, preserved in the waterlogged soil if they survive at all. They would have been simple constructions. Split logs or bundles of brushwood laid side by side, replaced as they rotted, following routes that had been established by generations of use. The Bronze Age people also built more elaborate structures. Settlements grew larger, more permanent. Chiefs and warriors accumulated wealth and power, marked by their possession of bronze weapons and ornaments. The dead were cremated now, their ashes buried in urns, often placed in cemeteries that served entire communities. The landscape was increasingly organized, divided, claimed. And then came iron, harder and more practical than bronze, and with it came the Celts, or rather, Celtic culture spread across Britain, whether through invasion or adoption remains debated by scholars. The Iron Age saw the development of hill forts, those dramatic earthwork enclosures that crowned so many British hilltops. The people of the Thames Valley organized themselves into tribes, each with its own territory, its own identity. The tribe that controlled the area around the future site of London was called the Trinovants, and later they would be supplanted or absorbed by the Cativaloni, who built their capital at Verulamium, which we know today as St. Albans. These were sophisticated societies with complex social structures, skilled craftspeople, and extensive trade networks reaching across Europe. But the immediate area of modern Trafalgar Square seems to have remained marginal during the Iron Age. Still marshy, still prone to flooding, still not the kind of place where you would build an important settlement. The higher ground to the north and west saw more activity, with farms and small villages, but the low-lying land near the Thames, where the Tyburn and other streams created a braided network of water and marsh, remained a transitional zone, a place you crossed rather than settled. The Iron Age Celts were the people whom the Romans encountered when they invaded Britain. And it is with the Romans that the story of London, and by extension, Trafalgar Square, truly begins. In 43 AD, the Emperor Claudius launched an invasion of Britain with 4 legions and auxiliary forces. The conquest was swift in the south and east, though it would take decades to subdue the entire island, and some parts would never be fully conquered. One of the first things the Romans did after establishing their beachhead was to push inland, securing the Thames crossing. They found a place where the river was narrow enough to bridge but deep enough for seagoing vessels to navigate, a place where 2 low gravel hills flanked the river, providing firm ground for building. This was the site they chose for their new settlement, which they called Londinium. Londinium was not initially intended to be a great city. It began as a military supply base, a crossing point on the Thames, a place where roads could converge. But it grew rapidly. Merchants and traders were attracted by its strategic location. Within a few years, it had become a bustling commercial center, a town of timber buildings spreading across both sides of the river, connected by a wooden bridge. The first London Bridge stood roughly where London Bridge still stands today, about 1.5 miles east of modern Trafalgar Square. But even though the city center was to the east, the area around future Trafalgar Square was affected by Roman presence. The Romans were great builders of roads, and they built a network of military roads radiating out from Londinium to connect their new province to the rest of their empire. One of these roads ran westward from Londinium, roughly following the route of modern Oxford Street before continuing into the countryside beyond. To build this road, the Romans had to cross the Tyburn and the other streams that flowed down from the northern hills. They built bridges, simple but effective structures that channeled the water through stone or timber arches while carrying the road across on a level platform. The road itself was a marvel of engineering, a raised causeway with foundations of large stones, layers of smaller stones and gravel, and a cambered surface that shed rainwater into ditches on either side. This was the famous Roman road construction that allowed their armies to move rapidly across Europe, that facilitated trade and communication across their vast empire. Along this road, soldiers marched, merchants drove their wagons, official messengers rode on imperial business. The area around the Tyburn crossing, where the road bridged the stream in the vicinity of what would become Trafalgar Square, began to see some development. Ribbon development, we might call it, buildings springing up along the road, taking advantage of the traffic that passed by. There were taverns where travelers could rest and refresh themselves, stables where horses could be changed, workshops where smiths and other craftspeople plied their trades. But this was still outside the main city. Londinium itself was to the east, growing rapidly, acquiring the amenities of Roman urban life, a forum, temples, bathhouses, and amphitheater. By the end of the 1st century AD, it had become the capital of the province of Britannia, superseding Camulodunum, modern Colchester, which had been the initial provincial capital. The area around modern Trafalgar Square remained somewhat marginal, though not uninhabited. Archaeological excavations in the vicinity have revealed traces of Roman activity, pottery shards, coins, the remains of structures. There may have been a small settlement here, or perhaps scattered farms and villas on the higher ground, with the low-lying areas still given over to market gardens and orchards that took advantage of the rich, moist soil near the streams. The Romans brought something else to Britain besides roads and towns. They brought Christianity. In the 4th century AD, as the Roman Empire itself became Christian, so too did Britannia. Churches were built, bishops appointed, Christian communities established. But Christianity in Roman Britain remained a minority religion, coexisting with the older pagan traditions that the Celts and Romans had practiced for centuries. And then, in the early 5th century, the Roman Empire began to crumble. Beset by barbarian invasions and internal strife, Rome withdrew its legions from Britain, leaving the province to fend for itself. The year 410 AD is traditionally given as the end of Roman Britain, though the reality was more gradual, more complex. Roman institutions and Roman culture didn't disappear overnight, but they faded, transformed, merged with the indigenous Celtic culture and the new influences that were arriving from across the North Sea. For the area around Trafalgar Square, the end of Roman rule meant abandonment and decay. Without the imperial infrastructure to maintain them, the roads fell into disrepair. The bridges over the Tyburn and other streams collapsed and were not rebuilt. The ribbon settlements along the roads were abandoned as trade declined and people retreated to more defensible positions. Londinium itself shrank dramatically. The great public buildings fell into ruin. The population declined to a fraction of what it had been. The walls that the Romans had built around the city still stood, but within them, much of the urban area returned to gardens and fields. London became a ghost of its former self, a walled enclosure containing ruins and memories. And what of the area around modern Trafalgar Square? The archaeological record suggests it was largely abandoned during the centuries that followed the Roman withdrawal. The streams flowed freely again, unbridged and uncontrolled. The clearings that had been made for fields and gardens were reclaimed by scrub and woodland. Wild animals returned, deer and boar, foxes and badgers. It became once again a borderland, a wild place between the slowly recovering settlements. This period, the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries, used to be called the Dark Ages, and while historians now prefer more neutral terms like the early medieval period, there's no denying that this was a time when the written record becomes sparse, when the material culture suggests a significant decline in population and prosperity. The Anglo-Saxons were arriving in Britain, settling, establishing kingdoms. They were pagan, worshipping gods like Woden and Thunor, though gradually they would be converted to Christianity by missionaries from Ireland and Rome. The Anglo-Saxons seemed initially to avoid the Roman cities. They were a rural people, more comfortable in small villages than in urban settlements. They built in timber, not stone, and their structures have left less permanent marks on the landscape. But slowly, tentatively, they began to reoccupy Londinium, or Londonwick, as they called it. Interestingly, the Anglo-Saxon settlement of London was not initially within the old Roman walls but to the west, along the Strand, the street that ran along the northern bank of the Thames connecting the city to Westminster. This area, which included the western approaches to what would become Trafalgar Square, saw the development of a trading settlement, a WIC, as the Anglo-Saxons called such places. Londonwick became an important trading center, a place where goods from the continent, wine, glass, pottery, were exchanged for British exports like wool, hides, and tin. Ships tied up along the riverbank, their cargoes unloaded onto the muddy shore. The settlement grew, spreading eastward and northward from the riverside, though it remained much smaller than Roman Londinium had been at its height. The Tyburn was still there, still flowing down from the north to meet the Thames, though its course may have shifted over the centuries. The area around its lower reaches, where Trafalgar Square would one day stand, remained marshy and undeveloped, used perhaps for grazing animals or growing hay, but not suitable for building. Christianity was returning to England during this period, spreading from two directions, from Ireland, where it had survived the fall of Rome, and from Rome itself, where Pope Gregory the Great sent a mission led by Augustine to convert the Anglo-Saxons. In 604 AD, a bishop was appointed for London, and churches began to be built. The most significant of these was the minster dedicated to St. Paul, built on the highest point within the old Roman walls, the site where St. Paul's Cathedral still stands today. But there were other churches too, smaller establishments scattered across the growing settlement and its surroundings. Some of these may have been in the area around modern Trafalgar Square, though the evidence is sparse. What we do know is that by the 8th and 9th centuries, London was once again a significant town, important enough to attract the attention of Viking raiders. The Vikings came in their longships, sailing up the Thames to attack the wealthy settlements along its banks. Londonwick was sacked multiple times. The Anglo-Saxon response was eventually to abandon the trading settlement along the Strand and retreat behind the old Roman walls, which could be more easily defended. The walled city was reoccupied and became known as London Borough, while the old settlement area became known as the Aldwick, the Old Trading Settlement. This shift in settlement patterns affected the area around Trafalgar Square. The Strand, which ran along its southern edge, became an important road again, connecting the newly refortified city to the growing settlement at Westminster, where the Anglo-Saxon kings were building a palace and abbey. The land between, including the future site of Trafalgar Square, remained largely rural, divided into fields and small holdings. The Tyburn continued to mark a boundary. To its east lay land associated with the City of London, to its west, land that belonged to Westminster. This boundary would remain significant for centuries, shaping the development of the area and creating jurisdictional complexities that would last into the modern era. By the time of the Norman conquest in 1066, London was the largest and wealthiest town in England, though it was still small by continental standards, perhaps 15,000 inhabitants within and around the old Roman walls. Westminster, a mile and a half to the west, was the site of royal power, where Edward the Confessor had built a great abbey church and a palace. William the Conqueror recognized London's importance. Though he was crowned at Westminster Abbey, he built fortifications to control the city, most notably the White Tower, the central keep of what would become the Tower of London. He also granted London a charter confirming its traditional rights and privileges, a shrewd political move that helped secure the city's acceptance of Norman rule. The area between the City of London and Westminster began to develop more intensively during the Norman and medieval periods. The Strand became lined with the great houses of nobles and bishops, who wanted residences convenient to both the commercial center of the city and the political center of Westminster. These were palatial establishments, surrounded by gardens and orchards, stretching back from the road toward the river. And what of the area that would become Trafalgar Square? It remained, even into the 13th and 14th centuries, a somewhat marginal zone. It was occupied, certainly, there were houses and shops, stables and workshops, but it had not yet taken on any special significance. It was simply the place where the Strand, running roughly east-west, was crossed by the road running north towards St. Giles and beyond. The Tyburn flowed through this area, though by now it may have been partially culverted or channeled to prevent flooding. There were bridges across it, simple structures, probably maintained by the parishes through which the stream flowed. The responsibility for maintaining bridges and roads was local in medieval England, assigned to the parish or manor, and the quality of maintenance varied enormously. To the north of this area lay the village of Charing, a small settlement that gave its name to the vicinity. The name Charing possibly derives from the Old English searing, meaning a bend or turn. Perhaps a reference to a bend in the Thames, or a turn in the road. By the late 13th century, Charing had become absorbed into the expanding urban area, no longer a separate village but part of the continuous built-up zone connecting Westminster to the city. One of the most significant developments in this area during the medieval period was the establishment of a royal stable and mews. The word mews originally referred to a place where hawks were kept during their molting season, from the French mew, meaning molt. But the term came to be applied to any royal stable complex, and there was such a complex in the area that would become Trafalgar Square. The Royal Mews was established here because of the area's convenient location between the Royal Palace at Westminster and the hunting grounds to the north. The king's horses, hawks, and hounds were kept here, cared for by a small army of grooms, falconers, and huntsmen. The mews was a substantial complex, including stables, living quarters for the staff, storage buildings for fodder and equipment, and exercise yards. This royal presence elevated the status of the area. Nearby land became more valuable. More substantial buildings were erected. The local taverns and shops benefited from the custom of the royal servants and the visitors who came on business related to the mews. The area began to acquire an identity, though it was still not a square, not a formal public space. Just a slightly wider place in the road, where several routes converged. Medieval London was a city of stark contrasts. Within the walls, the streets were narrow and crowded, the houses built close together, often overhanging the street as each story was built out beyond the one below. The city was noisy, smelly, vibrant with life. Markets crowded every available space. Churches rose above the roofline, their bells marking the hours of the day. The river was crowded with boats and ships, the wharves piled with goods from across the known world. But just outside the walls, just beyond the Strand, the character of the city changed. There was more space, more greenery. The great houses of the nobles had extensive gardens. Fields and orchards supplied the city with food. Streams flowed through water meadows. You could walk for half an hour and find yourself in genuine countryside. The area around the future Trafalgar Square occupied a middle ground, urban enough to have substantial buildings and a diverse population, but still open enough to have gardens and even small fields. The Tyburn flowed through, its water used by local residents for washing and watering gardens, though by this period it was already becoming polluted by the growing city. Life in medieval London was shaped by the rhythm of the seasons and the structure of the church year. The great festivals, Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, brought celebrations and holidays. Saints' days punctuated the calendar. Sunday was a day of rest, at least in theory, when work was supposed to cease and everyone attended church. The church was the dominant institution, owning vast amounts of land, wielding both spiritual and temporal power. But it was also a time of great insecurity. Plague swept through London multiple times during the 14th century. The Black Death of 1348 to 1349 killed perhaps a third of the city's population. Whole neighborhoods were depopulated. Bodies were buried in mass graves. The social and economic disruption was profound. Labor became scarce and expensive, social hierarchies were challenged, the old certainties seemed to crumble. The area around Charing Cross, the name now commonly applied to this vicinity, survived the plague, though doubtless many of its inhabitants died. The royal mews was maintained, for the king's needs continued regardless of pestilence. The great houses along the Strand, with their wealthy owners and better sanitation, fared somewhat better than the crowded tenements within the city walls. Let's pause here and consider what lay beneath the ground, even then. Every time a building was erected in medieval London, its foundations disturbed earlier remains. Roman pottery and coins turned up regularly, mysterious artifacts from a half-remembered past. Sometimes workmen digging cellars or wells would break through into Roman structures, a hypocaust, a pavement, a wall, remnants of Londinium's glory days. Deeper still lay the prehistoric layers. The flint tools of Mesolithic hunters, the pottery of Neolithic farmers, the bronze weapons and ornaments that had been buried with the dead thousands of years before. All of this lay beneath the streets of medieval London, a vertical archive of human history, mostly forgotten, occasionally glimpsed, never properly understood. The medieval Londoners had no concept of archaeology, no understanding of the immense span of time represented by these buried remains. When they found Roman bricks, they reused them in their own buildings. When they found ancient coins, they spent them if they were silver or gold, discarded them if they were bronze. The past was a quarry to be exploited, not a mystery to be solved. By the 15th century, London was recovering from the devastating plagues of the previous century. The population was growing again. Trade was expanding. The city was becoming wealthier, more sophisticated. The great guild halls were rebuilt in grander style. Merchants built imposing houses. The church constructed towering spires. And then came the Reformation, that great religious upheaval that tore apart the medieval church and reshaped English society. Henry VIII break with Rome, driven by his desire for a male heir and enabled by his conflict with the Pope, led to the dissolution of the monasteries and the redistribution of vast amounts of church property. In London, this meant that the great religious houses, the priories and abbeys that had owned much of the land around the city, were seized by the crown and sold off or granted to royal favorites. This transfer of property transformed the landscape around Trafalgar Square. Land that had belonged to Westminster Abbey or other religious institutions passed into private hands. New houses were built. Gardens were subdivided. The area became more densely occupied. The royal mews remained, but around it, the character of the neighborhood was changing from a semi-rural zone to an increasingly urban one. The Tudor period also saw the first attempts to regulate and control the Tyburn and other streams that flowed through London. These watercourses were becoming open sewers, their water too polluted for drinking or washing. Complaints about flooding and stench were common. Some stretches were culverted, covered over with stone or brick arches, allowing the water to flow hidden beneath the streets while the land above could be used for building. By the time Elizabeth I came to the throne in 1558, the area around Charing Cross was well established as part of London's western suburbs. It was respectable without being fashionable, useful without being essential, a place that people passed through on their way to somewhere else. The royal mews was still there, still housing the kings, now the queens, horses and hawks, but it was no longer the dominant feature of the area. The Thames, throughout all these centuries, remained the city's highway. The river was cleaner than the streets, faster than walking, the obvious way to travel between Westminster and the city. Wherries, small passenger boats, plied the river constantly, their watermen calling for custom from the stairs and landing places that lined the banks. Eastward ho, or westward ho, they cried, advertising their direction of travel. But London Bridge was the only bridge across the Thames until the mid-18th century. To cross the river, you either took a boat or you walked across the bridge, which was itself a neighborhood, a street of houses and shops built along both sides, narrowing the roadway to a dangerous bottleneck where traffic frequently jammed, and pedestrians and vehicles competed for space. The northern bank of the Thames, where the Strand ran, was lined with stairs, water gates where boats could land. Many of the great houses along the Strand had their own private stairs, elaborate structures with the owner's heraldic devices carved into the stone. These were the front doors of the aristocracy, for it was more dignified and more pleasant to arrive by boat than to arrive by road, splashed with mud and jostled by carts. One of the most significant of these great houses was Northumberland House, which stood at the eastern edge of what would become Trafalgar Square. This was the London residence of the Percy family, the Earls and later Dukes of Northumberland, one of the most powerful noble families in England. Their house was a palatial complex, with gardens stretching back from the Strand toward the north, encompassing several acres of prime London real estate. Northumberland House became a landmark, a reference point when giving directions. Near Northumberland House meant the area around the modern Trafalgar Square. The house itself was rebuilt several times, growing grander with each iteration, reflecting the wealth and power of its owners. It would stand until the 1870s, long after the area around it had been transformed, an anachronistic reminder of aristocratic London in the heart of an increasingly democratic city. The Stuart period, beginning with James I in 1603, saw continued development of this area. London was growing rapidly, spilling beyond its medieval boundaries, absorbing the surrounding villages and countryside. New squares were laid out in the fashionable West End, Covent Garden, Leicester Square, Soho Square, places where aristocrats and wealthy merchants built townhouses around communal gardens. But the area around Charing Cross remained a bit shabby, a bit commercial, not quite fashionable. It was too close to the Royal Mews with its smells of horses and hay, too much a thoroughfare rather than a residential address. The buildings were a mixture of periods and styles, medieval timber frames, Tudor brick, Stuart stone, a palimpsest of architectural history reflecting the layers of history beneath the ground. The English Civil War, that bitter conflict between king and parliament, between cavaliers and roundheads, between visions of what England should be, brought violence to London. Though the city was not besieged, it was garrisoned, fortified, made ready for attack. Earthwork fortifications were thrown up around the perimeter. Trained bands, the citizen militia, drilled in the parks and squares. The area around Charing Cross, on the route between Westminster and the city, saw soldiers passing frequently. Charles I was executed at Whitehall Palace in 1649, beheaded on a scaffold erected outside the banqueting house. Thousands witnessed the execution, standing in silence as the axe fell. The area around Charing Cross, just a few hundred yards away, was crowded with people waiting for news, for confirmation of the unthinkable, that England had killed its king. The Commonwealth and Protectorate that followed, under Oliver Cromwell, were austere times. Theatres were closed, festivals curtailed, pleasure gardens shut. London became more sober, more godly, or at least more outwardly pious. But human nature doesn't change, and beneath the surface of Puritan propriety, life went on much as before. The taverns of Charing Cross continued to serve ale and wine. The shops continued to trade. The watermen continued to ferry passengers up and down the Thames. The Restoration in 1660, when Charles II returned from exile to reclaim his father's throne, was celebrated with wild rejoicing. London erupted in festivities. The theatres reopened. The arts flourished. The court became a center of wit and culture, if also of scandal and intrigue. Charles II was a very different king from his father, clever, cynical, pleasure-loving, determined not to go on his travels again. During the Restoration period, the Royal Mews at Charing Cross continued to function, though its character was changing. Horses and hawks were still kept here, but increasingly the Mews also housed the royal coaches and carriages, those elaborate gilded vehicles that were used for state occasions. The Mews became as much a garage as a stable, reflecting the changing nature of royal transport. The late 17th century saw one of the most traumatic events in London's history, the Great Fire of 1666. Beginning in a bakery on Pudding Lane in the early hours of September 2nd, the fire spread rapidly through the tightly packed wooden houses within the city walls. For 4 days it burned, consuming everything in its path: houses, churches, shops, guild halls. When it finally burned itself out, 4/5 of the city within the walls was destroyed. But the fire did not reach the area around Charing Cross. The wind that drove the flames eastward also protected the western suburbs. Residents of the Strand watched the sky glow red to the east, saw the smoke rising in enormous columns, heard the roar of the flames and the crash of collapsing buildings. Refugees from the burning city poured westward, carrying what possessions they could save, seeking shelter wherever they could find it. In the aftermath of the fire, London was rebuilt, but not as it had been. The new city was built in brick and stone rather than timber. The streets were made wider. Regulations were introduced to reduce fire risk. Sir Christopher Wren designed the new St. Paul's Cathedral and dozens of parish churches, creating the skyline that would define London for the next 2 centuries. The rebuilding of the city might have been expected to benefit the western suburbs like Charing Cross, as businesses and residents looked for temporary and permanent premises outside the burned area. But in fact, most people chose to rebuild on their old sites, maintaining the city's traditional dominance as London's commercial centre. Charing Cross remained what it had been, a busy thoroughfare, a place between places. The late 17th and early 18th century saw significant improvements in London's infrastructure. Better street lighting was introduced, oil lamps on posts that made the streets safer at night, though the light they provided was dim and flickering, creating as many shadows as it dispelled. The streets themselves were paved with cobblestones, replacing the rutted mud and gravel that had made travel so unpleasant. Drains and sewers were improved, though the Tyburn and other streams still carried much of the city's waste. The Tyburn itself was becoming increasingly invisible during this period. More and more of its length was being built over, culverted beneath the expanding city. By the early 18th century, only short stretches of it remained open to the sky, and even these were often little more than drainage ditches, their banks lined with refuse, their water dark and foul-smelling. The pure stream that had flowed down from Hampstead Heath was now a sewer, carrying the accumulated waste of thousands of households. But water still flowed beneath the streets, still followed the ancient course that gravity and geology dictated. You could build over it, channel it, forget it was there, but you couldn't make it disappear. Every time there was heavy rain, cellars in the low-lying areas around Charing Cross would flood, the water rising up through the ground, reminding people that the Tyburn was still there, still flowing, still claiming its old path. The 18th century was a time of enormous change for London. The population grew rapidly, reaching nearly 1 million by the end of the century, making it the largest city in Europe. The expansion was not just in numbers but in physical extent. New districts were developed to the west and north. Great estates were divided into streets and squares, their aristocratic owners realizing they could make more money from property development than from farming. The area around Charing Cross benefited from this expansion. It was no longer on the edge of urban development but near the center of a growing metropolis. The neighborhood became more commercial, more bustling. Shops replaced residences. Taverns multiplied. Coffee houses opened, those distinctly 18th century institutions where men, and it was almost exclusively men, gathered to read newspapers, discuss politics, conduct business, and drink the bitter, stimulating brew that was becoming increasingly popular. The Royal Mews at Charing Cross was rebuilt several times during the 18th century as its functions evolved. By this period, it was primarily a coach house and stable rather than a mews in the original sense. The royal hawks had long since been dispersed to other establishments. The horses were still there, of course, the monarchy still depended on horse-drawn transport, and would continue to do so well into the 19th century. Around the Mews, the character of the neighborhood was decidedly mixed. There were respectable establishments, shops selling luxury goods, tailors and dressmakers serving wealthy clients, booksellers and print sellers offering the latest publications. But there were also seedier enterprises, gambling dens, brothels thinly disguised as taverns or lodging houses, places where stolen goods were sold, where criminals gathered. This mixture was typical of 18th century London. The city had not yet been sorted into rigidly separated districts of wealth and poverty, respectability and vice. Rich and poor lived in close proximity, often in the same buildings, wealthy families on the lower floors, poorer tenants in the garrets and cellars. You might step from an elegant drawing room into a street where pickpockets and prostitutes plied their trade. Crime was endemic in Georgian London. There was no organized police force. Law enforcement was the responsibility of parish constables, often elderly or incompetent, and watchmen, who were frequently the butt of jokes about their age and ineffectiveness. Catching criminals was largely the work of thief-takers, private individuals who made their living by apprehending wrongdoers and claiming the rewards that were offered for their capture. The most famous of these thief-takers was Jonathan Wild, who operated in the early 18th century. Wild claimed to be a public servant, helping victims recover their stolen property. In reality, he was running a criminal empire, organizing thefts and then recovering the goods for a fee, while turning in rival criminals to maintain his reputation and eliminate competition. He was finally exposed and hanged in 1725, his execution attended by enormous crowds who hurled abuse and refuse at him as he stood on the gallows. Executions were public spectacles in Georgian London, and the most famous execution site was Tyburn Tree, located near modern Marble Arch, where the Tyburn stream had once flowed freely. Criminals were transported there from Newgate Prison in open carts, stopping at taverns along the route for a final drink. Enormous crowds gathered to watch the hangings. Pickpockets worked the crowd even as their colleagues were being hanged for the same crime. The condemned were expected to die bravely, with a witty speech or stoic acceptance. Those who struggled or wept were despised. The route from Newgate to Tyburn passed through the area of Charing Cross, and on execution days, the neighborhood was thronged with people, some following the carts to Tyburn, others simply out to see the spectacle as it passed. Street vendors sold food and drink, ballad sellers offered printed accounts of the criminals' lives and crimes, pickpockets and prostitutes worked the crowd. It was carnival and tragedy combined, entertainment and warning, a reminder that the law's reach was long and its punishment final. But not all public gatherings in the area were so grim. Charing Cross was also a place where royal processions passed, where foreign ambassadors made their ceremonial entries, where military units paraded before departing for foreign wars. The area's location between Westminster and the city made it an inevitable part of any route that needed to connect the two centers of power. One of the most significant developments in the area during the mid-18th century was the clearance of some of the older, smaller buildings to create more open space. The idea of urban planning, of deliberately shaping the city according to aesthetic and practical principles, was gaining ground. Cities like Bath and Edinburgh were being rebuilt according to classical principles, with wide streets, elegant squares, harmonious proportions. London, with its medieval street pattern and haphazard growth, was harder to reform. But gradually, improvements were made. Streets were widened and straightened. Market areas were cleared and regularized. And in the area around Charing Cross, there were discussions about creating a more dignified public space, something that would be worthy of a great capital city. These discussions were given urgency by the need to do something with the Royal Mews. The building was old, inefficient, and occupied valuable land in an increasingly central location. There were proposals to move it elsewhere and develop the site. But such a move required royal approval, and approval required compelling reasons and alternative arrangements. While these discussions continued, life in the neighborhood went on. The Strand remained one of London's busiest streets, crowded with traffic, carriages and carts, pedestrians and livestock, sedan chairs carried by liveried servants, wagons loaded with goods for the city markets. The noise must have been tremendous, the clatter of hooves and wheels on cobblestones, the cries of street vendors and coachmen, the barking of dogs, the general hum of thousands of people going about their business. The smells would have been equally intense: horse manure and human waste, coal smoke and cooking food, the perfumes of wealthy passers-by mixing with the sweat and dirt of laborers, the particular aroma of each trade, baker's yeast, tanner's chemicals, butcher's blood. 18th century London assaulted all the senses, demanded constant attention, rewarded the alert and punished the unwary. And still, beneath all this human activity, the deeper layers of history lay undisturbed. The Roman road slept under the Georgian cobblestones. The Tyburn flowed in its culvert, forgotten by most. The Iron Age field boundaries and Bronze Age trackways, the Neolithic campsites and Mesolithic flint tools, all lay beneath the basements and cellars of Georgian London, waiting. The late 18th century brought political upheaval that would reshape the world. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, the wars that followed, all of these had their impact on London. The American War brought economic disruption and political debate about representation and rights. The French Revolution initially inspired hope among some Londoners who saw it as a blow for liberty, but as the revolution descended into terror and then into war, opinion turned sharply against it. The wars with revolutionary and Napoleonic France lasted, with brief interruptions, from 1793 to 1815, more than 20 years of conflict that affected every aspect of British life. London was never directly threatened. The Royal Navy kept invasion at bay, but the city felt the war's effects. Troops marched through on their way to embarkation ports. Wounded soldiers returned, many maimed for life. Prices rose. The national debt soared. And always there was the fear that somehow, despite the Navy, the French might find a way to land an army on British shores. The area around Charing Cross saw military activity throughout these years. Regiments mustered there before departing. Returning units marched through in triumph or trudged through in weary defeat. The inns and taverns did good business serving soldiers. And when news of victories arrived, the Battle of the Nile, Trafalgar, Waterloo, the area erupted in celebration, with illuminations, fireworks, and patriotic demonstrations. It was during these war years that serious planning began for the transformation of the area around the Royal Mews into a grand public square. The idea was to create a space that would commemorate Britain's naval victories and honor her greatest naval hero, Admiral Horatio Nelson, who had died at Trafalgar in 1805 even as he secured Britain's most famous naval victory. But such a project was expensive and complicated. It required not just clearing the Royal Mews but also purchasing and demolishing the surrounding buildings, creating a space large enough to be impressive. It required designing monuments that would be worthy of the nation's pride. And it required funding at a time when the treasury was strained by decades of war. So the project moved slowly. Nelson died in 1805. Plans for a memorial began to circulate almost immediately. Various schemes were proposed: a pyramid, a temple, a triumphal arch. But years passed with nothing built. The war continued, demanding money and attention. Other priorities intervened. The Royal Mews remained where it was, aging and increasingly unsuitable but still functional. The end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 brought peace at last, but also economic disruption. The sudden end of military spending threw thousands out of work. Returning soldiers and sailors flooded the labor market, driving down wages. There were food shortages, riots, political agitation. The government responded with repression. The notorious 6 acts that restricted public meetings and free speech, the suspension of habeas corpus, the use of troops to disperse demonstrations. One of the most infamous incidents occurred at St. Peter's Field in Manchester in 1819, when cavalry charged a peaceful gathering of tens of thousands who had assembled to demand parliamentary reform. 15 people were killed and hundreds injured in what became known as the Peterloo Massacre, a sardonic reference to Waterloo. The massacre shocked many and hardened political divisions, creating a climate of tension that would persist for decades. London saw its own political demonstrations during this period. Charing Cross, with its open space and central location, was a natural gathering point. Crowds assembled there to protest, to celebrate, to demand reform. The area became associated with political activity, a place where the voice of the people could be heard, however unwelcome that voice might be to the authorities. Meanwhile, the physical transformation of London continued. The Prince Regent, ruling on behalf of his incapacitated father George III, had grand visions for reshaping the capital. He commissioned John Nash, one of the era's most talented architects, to create a grand thoroughfare connecting his residence at Carlton House, near St. James's Park, with the new Regent's Park being developed in the northern suburbs. Nash's plan was ambitious. A sweeping street lined with elegant buildings, punctuated by circuses and crescents in the fashionable Regency style. Regent Street, as it would be called, was to run north from Carlton House, curving through what is now Piccadilly Circus and Oxford Circus before arriving at Regent's Park. The street would serve as a boundary between the fashionable West End and the less salubrious districts to the east, a physical manifestation of social division. The construction of Regent Street in the 1810s and 1820s had significant implications for the area around Charing Cross. The new street was nearby, bringing increased traffic and attention. The contrast between Nash's elegant new buildings and the older structures around Charing Cross made the latter look even more outdated and shabby. The case for redevelopment grew stronger. When George IV came to the throne in 1820, he had been Prince Regent since 1811, he showed even less interest in Carlton House than his father had. Eventually, he decided to demolish it entirely and commissioned Nash to build something grander. But the Royal Mews at Charing Cross would need to be moved first, as the horses and coaches needed somewhere to be housed during the construction work. The opportunity had arrived. In 1825, the Royal Mews at Charing Cross was finally closed, and a new mews was built at Pimlico, where it still stands today, though now it houses the royal collection of carriages and cars rather than working horses and vehicles. The site at Charing Cross was cleared, and planning began in earnest for the square that would commemorate Nelson and Britain's naval glory. But even with the site cleared, progress was slow. Funding remained an issue. The design had to be agreed upon. There were political complications. Who should be commemorated? How should they be honored? What should the square say about Britain and its place in the world? These were not simple questions, and they generated considerable debate. The architect chosen for the project was William Wilkins, who had already designed the National Gallery, which would occupy the north side of the new square. But Wilkins's plans were modified and second-guessed by various committees and officials. The result was a somewhat confused design process that took years to resolve. While the planning continued, the site remained largely vacant, a muddy, undeveloped space in the heart of London, surrounded by construction and controversy. Squatters moved in, building temporary shelters. Street vendors set up stalls. It became a gathering place for the homeless, the unemployed, the restless. The authorities periodically cleared the site, only to have it reoccupied within days. This was the London of Charles Dickens, whose novels would capture the vitality and misery of the Victorian city with unmatched vividness. Dickens knew the area around Charing Cross well. He worked nearby as a young man, walked these streets, observed the characters who populated them. In his novels, the area appears repeatedly as a place of transition, where characters from different social classes encounter each other, where the respectable and the disreputable mingle. The 1830s brought political reform at last. The Great Reform Act of 1832 extended the franchise, eliminated rotten boroughs, and gave representation to the new industrial cities. It was not democracy as we would understand it. Still only a small percentage of men could vote, and women had no vote at all, but it was a significant step, a recognition that the old political system could not survive unchanged in a rapidly modernizing society. Work on Trafalgar Square, the name had been officially adopted by this point, accelerated in the 1830s. The ground was leveled, though this required moving enormous amounts of earth, for the site was not naturally flat. The northern side was higher than the southern, reflecting the natural slope down toward the Thames. The decision was made to create a terraced square, with the northern part raised above the southern, connected by steps and retaining walls. This terracing involved significant excavation. And as the ground was dug away, as the foundations for the new buildings were laid, workers found remains of earlier structures, earlier lives. Roman pottery turned up in abundance. Medieval coins and jewelry. Post-medieval rubbish pits filled with discarded bottles and broken crockery. Each find was a message from the past, a reminder that this ground had been occupied for 2,000 years, that countless people had lived and worked here before. But in the 1830s, archaeology was still a young discipline, largely the hobby of antiquarians rather than a systematic science. Most of the finds were discarded, considered interesting curiosities at best, worthless rubbish at worst. A few items were preserved by individuals who happened to be interested, but there was no systematic recording, no attempt to understand the stratigraphy or context. Information that could have illuminated the history of this place was lost forever, destroyed in the rush to build the new square. The National Gallery opened on the north side of the square in 1838, housing the nation's collection of paintings in a building that was immediately controversial. Many thought Wilkins's design insufficiently grand, its Greek Revival style old-fashioned, its proportions awkward. But it was built, and it provided a magnificent backdrop for the square, even if it didn't satisfy the critics. The square itself was taking shape, though slowly. The layout was established, a large open space surrounded by roads, with a raised terrace on the north side. But what should occupy the center? The answer, everyone agreed, should be a monument to Nelson. But what form should it take? Various designs were proposed. Some suggested a statue at ground level. Others wanted an equestrian monument. There were proposals for temples, arches, obelisks. The debate dragged on for years while the square remained incomplete, its center empty, waiting for the monument that everyone knew should be there but no one could agree upon. Finally, in 1838, a competition was held, and the winning design came from William Railton, who proposed a tall column topped with a statue of Nelson, surrounded by bronze reliefs depicting his greatest victories. The design was classical in inspiration. Columns had been used to honor great men since Roman times, but its scale was unprecedented. At over 150 feet tall, it would dominate the square and be visible from great distances. The foundation stone was laid in 1840, and work began on the column that would become one of London's most iconic landmarks. The column itself was built of granite from Devon, hauled to London and raised piece by piece. The bronze reliefs at the base were cast from captured French cannons, a poignant reminder that Britain's naval supremacy had been won through the destruction of enemy ships, the deaths of enemy sailors. The statue of Nelson at the top of the column was carved by E.H. Bailey. Standing 17 feet tall, it showed the admiral in his familiar uniform, looking out over the city he had helped to preserve. The statue was raised to the top of the column in 1843, a complex engineering feat that drew crowds of onlookers who watched as the stone figure was slowly winched into place. Even with Nelson's column complete, the square was not finished. The bronze lions that would guard its base, perhaps the most beloved feature of Trafalgar Square today, were not added until 1867, designed by Sir Edwin Landseer and cast by Baron Marocchetti. There were fountains to be installed, statues and plaques to be erected, landscaping to be completed. The square that we recognize today took decades to achieve its final form. But let us return to what lies beneath, for that is our true subject. While Nelson's Column was rising above Trafalgar Square, what lay below remained largely unknown and largely ignored. The Tyburn still flowed in its culvert, now much deeper underground, channeled through Victorian brick sewers that carried not just the stream's water but also the waste from thousands of homes and businesses. The Roman road still lay there, buried but not destroyed, its foundations of large stone supporting the accumulated weight of 2 millennia of building. The medieval buildings that had once stood here had left their own traces: stone foundations, brick cellars, rubbish pits, graves from the churchyards that had once been in the area. All of these remained in the earth, compressed into a dense archaeological layer that recorded the history of human occupation. And beneath those layers, deeper still, lay the prehistoric remains, the bones of aurochs and wild horses, the flint tools of Mesolithic hunters, the pottery shards of Neolithic farmers. Beneath it all was the natural geology, the gravel terraces deposited by the Thames thousands of years ago, the London clay laid down millions of years before that, the bedrock that formed the foundation of everything. When the Underground came to Trafalgar Square, the Northern Line, opened in 1906, the tunneling exposed some of these layers. Workers cutting through the earth encountered unexpected obstacles: old walls, buried streams, pockets of soft ground where ancient marshes had been. The tunnels themselves became part of the archaeological record, a 20th century layer added to the palimpsest. During World War I, Trafalgar Square became a gathering place for crowds responding to news from the front. When war was declared in August 1914, thousands assembled in the square, some cheering, some silent, all aware that a terrible chapter in history was beginning. Over the next 4 years, the square saw recruiting rallies, victory celebrations, and solemn gatherings to mourn the dead. The square also became a site of protest and dissent. Suffragettes demonstrated here, demanding votes for women. Labor activists rallied here, calling for workers' rights. Anti-war campaigners gathered here, though they were often shouted down by pro-war crowds. The square's character as a place where the public could gather and make their voices heard was well established by this time. Between the wars, Trafalgar Square continued to serve as London's gathering place. On Armistice Day each November, crowds assembled to observe the 2-minute silence in memory of the fallen. Political demonstrations became more frequent as the 1930s brought economic depression and the rise of fascism in Europe. The British Union of Fascists held rallies in the square, as did their opponents. Clashes between the two groups were not uncommon. When World War II came in 1939, Trafalgar Square took on new significance. Nelson's Column became a symbol of British resistance. The admiral who had defeated Napoleon now seemed to watch over a city facing another invasion threat. The square was surrounded by sandbags and anti-aircraft guns. Air raid shelters were dug beneath it, adding another layer to the archaeological palimpsest. The Blitz, that sustained German bombing campaign against London from September 1940 through May 1941, caused tremendous damage to the area around Trafalgar Square. The square itself was hit several times. Buildings around its perimeter were damaged or destroyed. Fires raged through nearby streets. And yet the square survived, and Nelson's Column stood unscathed, a beacon of defiance. During the war years, the square served as a gathering place for rallies supporting the war effort, for celebrations of Allied victories, for solemn commemorations of defeats and losses. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Trafalgar Square was packed with celebrating crowds. People climbed onto the lions, onto the fountains, even attempted to scale Nelson's Column. The square became a site of collective joy and relief such as it had rarely seen. The post-war decades brought significant changes to London and to Trafalgar Square. The city that emerged from the war was damaged, exhausted, but also determined to build a better society. The welfare state was established, the National Health Service created, education expanded. London began to change from an imperial capital, the empire was rapidly dissolving, to something else, not yet clear, still being defined. Trafalgar Square reflected these changes. It became a site for protest movements of all kinds. Against nuclear weapons, against war in Vietnam, for civil rights, for workers' rights, for and against every political cause imaginable. The square's status as public space made it a natural gathering point, a place where dissent could be voiced, even if not always welcomed by the authorities. The square also became a tourist destination, one of the must-see sights of London. Visitors from around the world came to see Nelson's Column, to photograph the lions, to sit by the fountains. The square appeared in countless movies and television shows, its image broadcast globally. It became shorthand for London itself, a visual symbol recognized worldwide. But beneath the tourists and protesters, beneath the pigeons that had become such a feature of the square, feeding them became a beloved tourist activity, though it was eventually banned due to health and conservation concerns. Beneath all the visible activity, the hidden layers remained. The Tyburn continued to flow in its Victorian sewer. The Roman road continued to support the weight of modern London. The prehistoric and ancient remains continued their slow transformation from artifacts to fossils, compressed by time and weight into the permanent record. In the late 20th century, archaeological awareness began to grow. When any major construction project was undertaken in London, archaeologists were increasingly involved, documenting and preserving what they could before development destroyed it forever. But much of central London, including Trafalgar Square, was already so built up that archaeological investigation was difficult or impossible without massive disruption. What we know about what lies beneath Trafalgar Square comes largely from historical records, from observations made during various construction projects over the years, and from extrapolation based on archaeological work in nearby areas. We know the Tyburn flowed here because we can trace its course from upstream and downstream. We know there was Roman activity because Roman remains have been found in the vicinity. We know about the medieval occupation because of documentary evidence and the occasional artifact found during utility work. But there is surely much more down there, waiting to be discovered if the opportunity ever arises. Every time a utility company digs up a street near Trafalgar Square, there's a chance something will be found, a coin, a piece of pottery, a fragment of medieval paving. Usually such finds are small, unremarkable, not worthy of preservation. But occasionally something significant turns up, a piece of the puzzle that helps us better understand this place's long history. The 21st century has brought new uses and new meanings to Trafalgar Square. It was pedestrianized in the early 2000s, with the north side closed to traffic, making it easier for people to move between the square and the National Gallery. This change transformed how the space functions, making it more accessible, more welcoming, more clearly a public gathering place rather than a traffic intersection that happens to have a monument. The fourth plinth, originally intended to hold a statue that was never commissioned due to lack of funds, has become a rotating exhibition space for contemporary art. Every few years, a new work is installed, often controversial, always attention-getting. This use of the space acknowledges that public monuments don't have to be permanent bronze or stone, that each generation can leave its own mark, even if temporary. The square continues to be a site of protest and celebration. When London hosted the Olympics in 2012, it became a center of celebration. When political movements arise, whether opposing war, supporting climate action, or advocating for any of 1,000 causes, the square often becomes their gathering place. It is where Londoners come together, where they express their collective identity, where they claim their rights as citizens. And beneath all of this, the layers of history continue to accumulate. Modern utility tunnels run beneath the square, carrying fiber optic cables alongside Victorian water pipes. The underground tunnels hum with electric trains. The Tyburn flows on, forgotten by most, continuing its ancient journey from Hampstead to the Thames, though now entirely enclosed, entirely tamed, entirely hidden. If we could somehow see all these layers at once, see the full depth of history that lies beneath Trafalgar Square, what would we see? We would see the prehistoric landscape, wild and untouched, with only the occasional band of hunters passing through. We would see the Roman road, straight and purposeful, carrying the traffic of empire. We would see the medieval buildings, timber and thatch, crowding together along muddy streets. We would see the Tudor and Stuart development, brick and stone replacing wood, the city growing, spreading, becoming more permanent. We would see the Georgian improvements, the widening of streets, the lighting of lamps, the paving of roads. We would see the Victorian transformation, the creation of the square itself, the erection of Nelson's column, the imposition of order on what had been chaotic. We would see the 20th century's additions, the underground tunnels, the modern utilities, the war damage and repair. And we would see today's square, pedestrianized and welcoming, a space that belongs to everyone and to no one, that commemorates the past while serving the present. But we would also see something else. We would see continuity. Despite all the changes, despite the successive layers of building and rebuilding, there are constants. The Tyburn still follows its ancient course, even if hidden. The basic topography remains. This is still the place where the gentle slope from the northern hills meets the Thames floodplain. People still gather here for the same fundamental reasons they always have, because it's central, because it's accessible, because it's a place where you can see and be seen, where private individuals become part of a public collective. The history beneath Trafalgar Square is not just about the past, it's about continuity and change, about how we remember and forget, about how each generation leaves its mark while standing on the shoulders of those who came before. Every artifact buried beneath the square is a connection to someone who once lived, who once walked these streets, who once stood roughly where you might stand today, looking at a very different scene but experiencing fundamentally similar human emotions, joy and sorrow, hope and fear, wonder and weariness. Think about the Roman soldier who might have marched along the road here, far from his Mediterranean home, wondering if he'd ever see his family again. Think about the medieval servant hurrying through the rain to fetch water from the Tyburn, her feet slipping in the mud, thinking about the warm fire she'd left behind. Think about the Georgian shopkeeper opening his shutters at dawn, hoping today would bring enough customers to pay the rent. Think about the Victorian crossing sweeper, clearing horse manure from the street for pennies, looking up at the newly completed Nelson's column and marveling at its height. Think about the suffragette who stood in the square in 1913, demanding the vote, knowing she might be arrested but believing her cause was worth the risk. Think about the family who sheltered in the underground station below the square during a bombing raid in 1941, listening to the explosions above, holding each other close, trying to comfort frightened children. Think about the young person who came to the square in the 1960s to protest war, believing their generation could change the world. Think about the tourist who visited last week, taking selfies with the lions, unaware of the depth of history beneath their feet. All of these people, separated by centuries or decades, connected by this place. Their physical traces, the things they dropped or discarded, the structures they built, the graves where they were buried, lie beneath the square, compressed into the archaeological record. But they live on in other ways too, in the laws they passed, the causes they championed, the buildings they erected, the city they shaped. London itself is a palimpsest, a manuscript that has been written and erased and written again countless times, with each layer leaving traces that bleed through to affect what comes after. Trafalgar Square is perhaps the most concentrated example of this layering, a place where history is quite literally piled up, layer upon layer, each representing a different moment, a different vision of what this place should be. The name itself, Trafalgar Square, commemorates a battle fought in 1805 off the coast of Spain, a battle that secured British naval supremacy for a century but cost the life of the admiral who won it. Nelson died in the moment of victory, shot by a French sniper, spending his last hours below decks on his flagship Victory, knowing he had won but would not live to enjoy the triumph. "Thank God I have done my duty," he reportedly said as he died, words that became famous, that helped shape how the Victorian British understood heroism and sacrifice. The decision to name the square after this battle, to erect a column to Nelson, reflected certain values: military glory, naval power, national pride. These were the values of an imperial nation at the height of its power, confident in its mission to rule the waves and civilize the world. The square was meant to embody these values, to remind British citizens of their nation's greatness, to inspire them to similar heights of duty and sacrifice. But values change, empires fall, certainties crumble. The Britain that erected Nelson's column no longer exists. The empire it defended is gone, dissolved peacefully for the most part, leaving behind a commonwealth of independent nations. The naval supremacy the column celebrates ended long ago, superseded by air power and nuclear weapons. Even the pigeons that were once such a feature of the square are gone, driven away by concerns about disease and building damage. Yet the square remains, and Nelson's column still stands, but their meanings have changed. The square is no longer primarily about celebrating military victory, it's about public space, about the right to gather and protest, about civic identity in a multicultural city. The column is still there, still impressive, but it's become a backdrop, a familiar landmark, rather than a rallying point for imperial pride. This transformation of meaning is itself part of the history beneath our feet. The physical layers remain stable, the Roman road doesn't change, the Tiber still flows on the same path, but the interpretive layers shift constantly. Each generation sees the square differently, uses it differently, finds different meanings in its monuments. And what of the future? What will lie beneath Trafalgar Square a century from now, or a millennium? If we continue to build and rebuild as humans always have, new layers will be added, new utility tunnels, perhaps new underground lines, new structures whose purposes we can't yet imagine. Our generation's refuse will join the Roman pottery and medieval coins in the archaeological strata, providing evidence for future scholars about how we lived, what we valued, what we discarded. Or perhaps the square will be preserved much as it is, becoming itself a historical artifact, maintained because of its significance rather than its utility. Perhaps future Londoners will walk across it knowing they're treading on a site that has been important for centuries, feeling connected to their predecessors through this shared space. Or perhaps, though we hope not, London will be abandoned, its buildings crumbling, its streets overgrown, returning to the wilderness that existed here before humans arrived. If that happens, the layers beneath Trafalgar Square will remain, compressed together, waiting for some future archaeologist, perhaps not even human, to excavate and try to understand what this place meant, why it mattered, what stories it has to tell. But let's not end on such a melancholy note. For now, Trafalgar Square remains very much alive, very much a working part of London. People cross it every day, commuters hurrying to work, tourists pausing to take photos, protesters gathering to make their voices heard, lovers meeting by the fountains, children running up and down the steps. The square fulfills its function as public space, as gathering place, as civic center. And beneath their feet, unnoticed and mostly unknown, the layers of history remain. The Tiber flows on in its Victorian brick sewer, carrying rainwater and waste to the Thames treatment plants. The Roman road lies dormant, its stones still capable of bearing weight if ever exposed. The medieval foundations sleep beneath basements and cellars. The prehistoric landscape waits at the bottom of it all, the gravel terraces and London clay that underlie everything, the geological foundation upon which all human history here has been built. This layering, this depth, this accumulation of history, this is what makes London London. It's not just the buildings you can see, impressive though they are. It's not just the famous landmarks, important though they may be. It's the depth, the sense that everywhere you stand, you're standing on the shoulders of thousands of years of human occupation, that the ground beneath your feet has been walked on by countless people before you, that you're part of a continuity stretching back to the first hunter-gatherers who camped by the Thames. Trafalgar Square, in this sense, is everywhere in London. Every street, every building, every park sits atop layers of history. Dig anywhere in central London and you'll find similar stratification, Roman walls beneath medieval churches, Victorian sewers cutting through prehistoric deposits, each era leaving its mark, each generation adding to the palimpsest. But Trafalgar Square is special because of its visibility, its centrality, its role in the city's life. It's a place where London gathers to mark its important moments, victories and defeats, celebrations and commemorations, protests and proclamations. It's a place that appears in countless photographs and paintings, films and novels, a place that represents London to the world. And beneath it all lies this hidden archaeology, this secret history, this vertical archive of human presence. The story of what lies beneath Trafalgar Square is ultimately a story about time, how it accumulates, how it compresses, how the past never really disappears but instead becomes part of the present. The Tyburn hasn't gone away just because it's been buried. The Roman road hasn't ceased to exist just because it's covered by later building. The prehistoric landscape hasn't been erased just because we can't see it. Instead, all these layers coexist, occupying the same space but separated by time, like the pages of a book all pressed together, each page telling its own story but all of them part of a larger narrative. To understand Trafalgar Square, or any place, really, we need to think vertically as well as horizontally, to remember that history has depth as well as breadth, that the past lies beneath us as surely as it lies behind us. This way of thinking about place and time can change how we see the world around us. When you walk across Trafalgar Square, or any urban space, you might find yourself wondering what lies beneath your feet. Is there a buried stream? An old foundation? A fragment of Roman pottery? What stories does this ground hold? Who walked here before you? What did they see? What did they think? What did they dream? These questions connect us to the past in a visceral way. History becomes not just dates and events in textbooks but something real, something tangible, something that exists in physical space. The Roman soldier who marched along that road, the medieval servant who drew water from the Tyburn, the Georgian shopkeeper who opened his shutters at dawn, they all become more real when we remember that they occupied the same physical space we occupy now, that they stood where we stand, that only time separates us. And time, for all its power, is not as absolute as we sometimes think. Yes, the Roman soldier lived 2,000 years ago, and we cannot meet him, cannot speak with him, cannot know his thoughts except through the fragmentary evidence he left behind. But the road he helped to build still exists beneath modern London, still serves its purpose of providing a firm foundation, still connects the same basic points of the compass. In that sense, his labor continues, his contribution persists, the work of his hands still matters. This is the deeper meaning of what lies beneath Trafalgar Square. It's not just about physical artifacts and archaeological layers, though those are fascinating in themselves. It's about continuity, about how human effort accumulates over time, about how each generation builds on what came before, even when they don't realize it, even when they've forgotten what lies beneath. The Victorian engineers who built the sewer that now carries the Tyburn probably didn't think much about the stream's ancient history. They had practical concerns: where to route the sewer, how to ensure proper flow, how to prevent flooding. But in building their sewer, they preserved the Tyburn's course, ensuring that water still flows along roughly the same path it followed when prehistoric aurochs came to drink from it, when Roman soldiers crossed it on their way to Londinium, when medieval servants drew their water from it. This is how history works, not through grand, conscious preservation efforts, though those have their place, but through the accumulation of practical decisions, each made for immediate reasons, each unintentionally preserving or destroying what came before. The shape of modern London has been determined by thousands of such decisions: to route a street this way rather than that, to build a bridge here rather than there, to preserve this building or demolish that one. And beneath all these decisions, beneath all the building and rebuilding, the fundamental geography remains. The Thames still flows where it has flowed for millennia, though its banks are now confined by embankments. The hills that surround London still rise where they always have, though they're now covered with buildings rather than forest. The gravel terraces that attracted the first settlers still provide firm foundation, though they're buried beneath meters of human construction. This is what makes London, and by extension, Trafalgar Square, such a rich subject for contemplation. It's not just one thing, not just one moment in time, but an accumulation of moments, a layering of experiences, a palimpsest that rewards close reading. Every surface conceals depths. Every street has substrata. Every building stands on foundations that go back further than the building itself, sometimes much further. As we think about what lies beneath Trafalgar Square, we're really thinking about something larger, about how places acquire meaning through time, about how history becomes embedded in geography, about how the past shapes the present even when we're unaware of it. The square is more than just the space we can see. It's also all the earlier squares that occupied this space, all the buildings that stood here before, all the people who passed through, all the events that occurred. In a sense, when you stand in Trafalgar Square, you're standing in all the Trafalgar Squares that have ever existed. The wild floodplain of prehistoric times, the Roman road crossing, the medieval settlement, the Royal Mews, the Victorian Square under construction, the wartime gathering place, the modern tourist destination. They're all here, all present, all occupying the same space, separated only by the dimension of time. This multiplicity, this coexistence of different times and places in the same location, is what gives historic cities like London their particular character. Unlike newer cities built all at once according to a single plan, London has grown organically over millennia, each era adding its own layer, creating a richness and complexity that can't be replicated through planning alone. Some might say that this complexity is inefficient, that it would be better to clear away the accumulated clutter of history and start fresh with a rational, modern design. And indeed, such proposals have been made at various times, most dramatically after World War II, when the bomb damage provided an opportunity for wholesale redevelopment. Some areas of London were rebuilt according to modernist principles, with tower blocks and shopping centers replacing the intricate street patterns and mixed-use buildings of the past. But Trafalgar Square was preserved, protected by its symbolic importance and its architectural significance. The decision to preserve rather than replace reflects a recognition that historic places have value beyond their practical utility, that they serve purposes cultural, psychological, spiritual, that can't be reduced to efficiency or functionality. What are those purposes? One is memory. Physical places help us remember the past, provide tangible connections to earlier times. When we see Nelson's column, we remember the Battle of Trafalgar, even if we don't know the details, even if naval warfare means nothing to our daily lives. The monument serves as a memory aid, a physical manifestation of history that would otherwise exist only in books and documents. Another purpose is identity. Places help us understand who we are, where we come from, what community we belong to. Londoners identify with Trafalgar Square, claim it as theirs even though it belongs to everyone. When something happens in the square, a celebration, a protest, a tragedy, Londoners feel personally connected because this is their space, part of their city's identity and therefore part of their own. A third purpose is continuity. Places provide a sense of stability in a changing world. The square has been there for nearly 2 centuries, a constant presence in a city that has changed dramatically in that time. The London of 1840 and the London of 2025 are vastly different, in population, economy, technology, culture, but Trafalgar Square has been there throughout, providing a fixed point, a constant in the midst of change. And finally, there's something harder to name. A sense of depth, of significance, of meaning that comes from knowing that a place has history, that it has witnessed important events, that it matters. Standing in Trafalgar Square is different from standing in an anonymous parking lot precisely because the square has this aura of significance, this sense that what happens here matters, that you're part of something larger than yourself. All of this is connected to what lies beneath, not in the sense that people consciously think about the Roman road or the Tyburn when they visit the square, but in the sense that the accumulation of history gives the place a weight, a gravitas, a significance that newer places lack. The square has earned its importance through time, through the accumulation of events and memories and meanings. This is why preservation matters, why archaeology matters, why we should care about what lies beneath our feet. It's not just about old things for their own sake, though old things can be fascinating. It's about understanding where we come from, recognizing that we're part of a continuum, accepting our responsibility to the past and the future as well as the present. When we preserve historic places, when we study what lies beneath them, when we tell their stories, we're not just looking backward. We're also looking forward, ensuring that future generations will have the same opportunities we've had to connect with the past, to learn from it, to draw inspiration or warning from it. We're acknowledging that we're temporary stewards of these places, that they were here before us and will be here after us, that our role is to care for them and pass them on. This responsibility can feel heavy, especially in a city like London where there's so much history, where every street corner has a story, where the weight of the past can seem overwhelming. How do you balance preservation with progress? How do you honor the past without being trapped by it? How do you create space for the new while respecting the old? These are not easy questions, and different people will answer them differently. But thinking about what lies beneath, literally and figuratively, can help us approach these questions more thoughtfully. When we understand the depth of history in a place, we're more likely to make careful decisions about how to treat it. When we recognize that we're adding our own layer to a palimpsest that extends back thousands of years, we're more likely to think about what we want that layer to say, what we want future generations to find when they excavate our time. The story of Trafalgar Square is not finished. The square continues to evolve, continues to acquire new meanings, continues to serve London's needs. The recent pedestrianization, the rotating artworks on the fourth plinth, the various events and gatherings that occur there, all of these are adding new chapters to the story, creating new memories, giving new generations reasons to care about this place. And beneath it all, the hidden layers remain, patient and silent, waiting. The Tyburn flows on in its Victorian sewer, its water mingling with rain and waste, eventually reaching the Thames and then the sea, completing a cycle that began when that water fell as rain on Hampstead Heath. The Roman road lies buried but unbroken, its stones still fitted together as tightly as when they were first laid, still capable of bearing weight. The prehistoric gravel terraces rest at the bottom, the foundation of everything, the geological reality upon which all human history has been built. If we could somehow preserve a cross-section through Trafalgar Square, like a geologist's sample showing all the strata, what a museum piece it would be. Each layer would tell its story, the charcoal from a Mesolithic campfire, the potsherd from a Neolithic bowl, the bronze pin dropped by an Iron Age woman, the tile from a Roman hypocaust, the timber from a medieval building, the brick from a Georgian house, the iron from a Victorian sewer, the concrete from a 20th century foundation, the fiber optic cable from our own digital age. Each artifact would be small in itself, perhaps insignificant, but together they would tell an epic story, the story of human presence in this place, of our gradual transformation of the landscape, of our accumulated efforts and achievements and failures. They would show how we've changed, in our technology, our values, our understanding of the world. And how we've stayed the same, still needing shelter and water and community, still gathering in public spaces, still marking our important moments with monuments and ceremonies. This story, the story of what lies beneath Trafalgar Square, is also your story and mine. We're the latest characters in this long narrative, adding our own small contributions to the accumulated history. Every time we cross the square, every time we gather there for a celebration or a protest, every time we meet a friend by the fountains or photograph the lions, we're participating in the ongoing life of this place, adding to its store of memories, helping to shape what it means and what it will become. And one day, we too will be part of what lies beneath. Not literally, we won't be buried under Trafalgar Square, but figuratively. We'll be part of the past, part of the history that future generations will study and wonder about. They'll look at photographs of us and see strange fashions, outdated technology, quaint beliefs. They'll wonder what we were thinking, what we valued, what we dreamed about. And perhaps, if they're lucky, they'll find some artifact we left behind, some small thing that survived, and they'll hold it and think about the person who owned it, who used it, who then discarded or lost it, never imagining it would still exist centuries later. This is the fundamental humility that history teaches us, that we're not as special or as permanent as we sometimes think. The Romans probably thought their empire would last forever, that the road they built through this area would always carry Roman traffic to Roman destinations. The medieval inhabitants probably couldn't imagine a world without the church's dominance, without the social hierarchies they took for granted. The Victorians probably believed their empire would endure, that the square they created would always commemorate British naval supremacy. All of them were wrong. Empires fall, beliefs change, certainties crumble. The only constant is change itself, and even that is mediated by the geography and geology that underlie everything. The Thames will still flow long after London is forgotten. The gravel terraces will still be there long after the last building has crumbled to dust. The fundamental landscape will endure while human landscapes come and go. But this shouldn't make us despair or feel our efforts are meaningless. Instead, it should inspire us to do our best, to add our layer to the palimpsest thoughtfully, to leave behind something worth finding. We can't control how future generations will judge us, but we can try to be worthy of the inheritance we've received, to care for the places and traditions and knowledge that have been passed down to us, and to pass them on enriched rather than diminished. Trafalgar Square, and what lies beneath it, embodies this ongoing process of inheritance and bequest. We've received this place from previous generations who cleared the royal mews, who erected Nelson's column, who designed the fountains and terraces, who planted trees and installed benches, who used the square for their own purposes and then passed it on to us. And we in turn will pass it on to future generations, having used it for our purposes, having added our own layer to its history, having made our own small contribution to its ongoing story. What will we bequeath? That depends on the choices we make. If we care for the square, maintain its monuments, preserve its character while allowing it to evolve, we'll pass on something vital and meaningful. If we neglect it, allow it to decay, or thoughtlessly alter it, we'll pass on something diminished. The choice is ours, as it has been for every generation that came before us. But whatever we do, the deeper layers will remain. The Tiber will still flow, even if forgotten. The Roman road will still lie there, even if undiscovered. The prehistoric landscape will still wait at the bottom, unchanged by all that has been built above it. These are the constants, the foundations, the bedrock upon which everything else rests. And perhaps that's the final lesson of what lies beneath Trafalgar Square, that beneath all the human drama, all our building and rebuilding, all our conflicts and celebrations, all our memories and meanings, there's something more fundamental, more enduring. The land itself, shaped by rivers and ice and time, provides the stage on which human history unfolds. We're actors on that stage, important to ourselves but perhaps not as important as we imagine to the larger story of this place. The water that falls as rain on London today is the same water that fell as rain in prehistoric times, that the Romans used, that flowed through medieval streets, that turned Victorian water wheels, that quenched the thirst of people throughout history. It's part of an endless cycle, rain to river to sea to evaporation to rain again, that continues regardless of human activity, that will continue long after humans are gone. The stone that forms the bedrock beneath London crystallized hundreds of millions of years ago, when Britain was in a different part of the world, when the climate was tropical, when the creatures that would become fossil fuels were alive. That stone has witnessed transformations we can barely imagine, continents drifting, oceans opening and closing, ice ages coming and going, species evolving and going extinct. Against that time scale, all of human history is a brief moment, barely a heartbeat. This perspective, what scientists call deep time, can be dizzying, even frightening. It makes our concerns seem trivial, our achievements insignificant. What does it matter whether we preserve Trafalgar Square or replace it with something else, when in a few million years it will all be eroded away anyway? What does it matter what we do, when we're such temporary residents of this planet? But I think that perspective, while important to maintain occasionally, shouldn't dominate our thinking. Yes, in deep time we're insignificant. But we don't live in deep time. We live in human time, measured in years and generations, where our choices do matter, where what we do has consequences for ourselves and our descendants. We should acknowledge the deeper perspective, use it to keep our pride in check, but then return to the human scale where our lives actually happen. At the human scale, Trafalgar Square matters. It matters to the millions who visit it, who gather there, who have memories connected to it. It matters to London's identity, to Britain's sense of itself. It matters as a gathering place, as a symbol, as a connection to the past and a gift to the future. The fact that it won't matter in a million years doesn't make it not matter now. And the same is true for what lies beneath. The layers of history buried under the square might seem insignificant compared to the geological timescale, but they're profoundly significant at the human scale. They connect us to our ancestors, help us understand where we came from, remind us that we're part of something larger than ourselves, not in the cosmic sense, but in the historical and cultural sense. This is why we tell stories about the past, why we preserve historic places, why we dig in the earth to find what our ancestors left behind. Not because these things matter on a cosmic scale, they don't, but because they matter on a human scale, and that's the scale at which we live and love and dream and die. So let us return, in closing, to Trafalgar Square as it exists today. Picture it in your mind, the open space, the fountains playing, the lions keeping their patient watch, Nelson's column rising toward the sky, the National Gallery providing its neoclassical backdrop. Picture the tourists taking selfies, the protesters holding signs, the street performers entertaining crowds, the pigeons, no, wait, the pigeons are gone, vanished years ago. Picture instead the people, just the people, using the space in all the myriad ways that people use public spaces. And now picture beneath them, not just the Victorian sewers and underground tunnels, though those are there. Not just the Roman road and medieval foundations, though those are there too. Picture all the layers of history, compressed together like the pages of a book, each one telling its story, each one connected to the others above and below. Picture the Tyburn flowing in the darkness, patient and eternal, carrying its water to the Thames as it has for thousands of years. Picture the gravel terraces laid down by the ancient river, the stones rounded and sorted by flowing water, now locked in place beneath tons of human construction. Picture the flint tools dropped by Mesolithic hunters, the pottery shards from Neolithic settlements, the bronze ornaments from Iron Age burials. Picture the Roman soldiers' hobnailed sandals striking the stone road, the medieval servant's bucket splashing in the stream, the Georgian shopkeeper's candle lighting his window at dawn. Picture the Victorian workman digging the sewer, the Edwardian suffragette raising her sign, the Blitz survivor sheltering in the underground below. Picture all of this compressed together, coexisting, all the same place but different times, all the same earth but different uses, all part of the same long story of human presence in this particular spot on Earth's surface. This is what lies beneath Trafalgar Square, not just physical artifacts, but the whole rich accumulation of human experience, of lives lived and deaths mourned, of work done and dreams dreamed, of the gradual transformation of wilderness into a great city symbolic center. And now, dear friend, our journey comes to its end. We've traveled together through time, descending through the layers of history buried beneath Trafalgar Square, from the present day back through centuries and millennia to the prehistoric landscape where our story began. We've met Romans and Saxons, Normans and Tudors, Georgians and Victorians. We've traced the course of the lost river Tyburn, followed the route of Roman roads, watched as a royal mews became a great public square. We've seen how each generation leaves its mark on the landscape, adding another layer to the palimpsest, and how the landscape in turn shapes the lives of those who inhabit it. We've learned that history has depth as well as breadth, that what lies beneath is as important as what stands above, that to understand a place fully we must think vertically through time as well as horizontally through space. But more than that, I hope we've learned something about continuity, about how the past and present are connected, about how we're part of a long chain of human existence stretching back to the first people who stood on this ground and forward to generations yet unborn who will stand here when we're gone. We're temporary stewards of places like Trafalgar Square, links in a chain, participants in a story that was old when we arrived and will continue after we depart. This understanding brings both humility and responsibility. Humility because we recognize we're not as unique or as important as we sometimes think. We're doing what countless people before us have done, living our lives, making our small marks on the world. Responsibility because we recognize that what we do matters, that we can either preserve and enrich what we've inherited or damage and diminish it, and that our choices will affect those who come after us. As you drift towards sleep now, perhaps you'll dream of Trafalgar Square, not just as it is, but as it has been, as it might be. Perhaps you'll dream of walking through its various incarnations, meeting the people who knew it when it was wilderness, when it was farmland, when it was a royal mews, when it was a freshly built monument to naval glory, when it was a gathering place for protests or celebrations. Perhaps you'll dream of descending through those layers of history, like an archaeologist excavating in reverse, discovering what lies beneath. Or perhaps you'll simply rest, your mind at peace, secure in the knowledge that places like Trafalgar Square endure, that history continues, that the long story of human presence on this earth goes on, adding new chapters while the old ones remain, layer upon layer, depth upon depth, memory upon memory. The past is not lost. It's beneath our feet, compressed into earth, waiting to be remembered. The future is not yet written, but we're writing it now with every choice we make, every action we take. And the present, this moment, right now, is where we live, where we connect past and future, where we add our own small verse to the great poem of human history. Sleep well, dear friend. Rest in the knowledge that you're part of something larger and older and more enduring than any individual life. The ground beneath you holds countless stories, the air around you carries the echoes of vanished voices, the water that flows through hidden channels beneath the streets connects you to every person who has ever lived in this place. You are not alone. You have never been alone. You are part of the long human story, the endless chain of being, the eternal dance of memory and forgetting, building and decay, presence and absence. And when you wake, perhaps you'll see the world a little differently. Perhaps you'll walk across familiar ground and wonder what lies beneath. Perhaps you'll touch an old building and think about the hands that built it. Perhaps you'll stand in a public square and feel the weight of all the people who stood there before you, all the events that occurred there, all the history compressed into that place. This is the gift that history gives us, not just knowledge of the past, but a deeper appreciation of the present, a recognition that we're part of something larger, a connection to the long chain of human experience. And this is why places like Trafalgar Square matter, why what lies beneath them matters, why we should care for them and study them and pass them on to future generations enriched by our care and attention. The story ends here, but the history continues. The Tiber flows on beneath London's streets. The Roman road lies patient in the earth. The prehistoric landscape waits at the bottom of it all. And above them, life continues, people crossing the square, gathering, protesting, celebrating, simply being. Each day adds another layer, another memory, another small contribution to the endless accumulation of history that makes London London, that makes Trafalgar Square what it is, that connects us all, past, present, and future, in the eternal human story. Rest now. Dream of deep time and human time, of rivers visible and hidden, of layers compressed like pages in a book. Dream of all who came before and all who will come after. Dream of the ground beneath your feet and the history it holds. Dream of Trafalgar Square and what lies beneath. Good night, dear friend. May your rest be peaceful, your dreams be gentle, and your waking bring renewed wonder at the rich and layered world we inhabit. Until we meet again in another quiet corner of history, sleep well.